There is a wall in ancient Mesopotamia that has not been fully explained, not by archaeologists, not by historians, not by the institutions that fund their research and publish their conclusions. The wall is old, not old in the way we casually use that word, old in the way that collapses time, 6,000 years old, and carved into it, with a precision that would be impressive even by modern standards, is a figure standing over a human body. The figure has the head of a bird, long beak, feathered crest, hollow eye carved deep into stone, and in its hands, held with unmistakable intentionality, is something that every surgeon alive today would recognize immediately. That image has been sitting in museum storage, in academic footnotes, in the margins of Sumerian scholarship, for over a century. And the explanation that mainstream archaeology settled on is almost more unsettling than the image itself. They called it ritual. They called it ceremonial. They wrote about purification rites and symbolic cosmology and left it there. Case closed. Move on. But if you look at what the figure is actually holding, if you trace the lines the ancient carver took the time to make, if you read the Sumerian medical texts found in the same region, at the same depth, from the same civilization, the ritual explanation stops holding weight. Something else starts to take its place, something that the field of archaeology has no comfortable category for. This is the story of the bird-headed figures of ancient Sumer. What they were doing, what they were holding, why nobody with institutional authority wants to answer those questions directly, and what it means that a civilization 6,000 years ago carved these scenes with the same matter-of-fact detail they used to carve grain storage records and property deeds. If you want to keep going deeper on the hidden history that mainstream scholarship refuses to touch, subscribe before we go further. Hit that bell. Every week there is something new, and it does not come from the approved reading list. The civilization we are talking about is Sumer. It occupied the southern region of what is now Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the area the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia. It is the oldest urban civilization in the recorded historical record. Cities, writing, law, agriculture at scale, astronomy, mathematics, all of it appeared in Sumer with a speed that still makes archaeologists uncomfortable when they are being honest. There was no slow build-up. There was no gradual accumulation. The Sumerians themselves said plainly in their own texts that they received their knowledge from beings who came before them. They were specific about this. They wrote it down, they carved it into walls. They had a word for these beings, the Apkallu. The Apkallu appear throughout Sumerian and Akkadian religious and historical texts as the seven sages, the antediluvian wise ones, the beings who brought civilization to humanity before the Great Flood. In the texts, they are described as being sent by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, from the Abzu, which was a subterranean freshwater ocean the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth. They are described as not fully human. They are described as teachers, as instructors, as the ones who showed humanity how to build, how to govern, how to heal. And in the visual record, the Apkallu are depicted in one of two ways. The first is as a human figure wearing a fish-skin cloak, emerging from or associated with water. The second, which is the one this conversation is about, is as a figure with a fully non-human head, specifically the head of a bird. And these bird-headed Apkallu are almost always shown in proximity to a human body, standing over it, reaching toward it, holding instruments. The cylinder seals are where this becomes impossible to explain away comfortably. Cylinder seals were small stone objects used in ancient Mesopotamia as identification and authentication tools, rolled across wet clay to leave an impression. Thousands of them survive. They are one of the most detailed visual records of Sumerian and Akkadian belief and daily life that we have. And on multiple cylinder seals, across different time periods and different sites, the same scene appears. A human figure horizontal, in a position that can only be described as the position of a patient, a bird-headed figure standing or kneeling over them. And in the hands of the bird-headed figure, objects that require explanation. The standard explanation offered by mainstream scholars is that these scenes depict exorcism rituals. the removal of evil spirits or disease-causing demons through ceremonial action. This interpretation sits comfortably within the academic framework of ancient religion as superstition dressed up as practice. It lets scholars look at a carved surgical instrument and call it a ritual tool. It lets them describe a scene of a figure opening the body of another figure and call it symbolic. It is a framework that makes the ancient Sumerians seem primitive. It makes their medicine seem like theater. It makes the bird-headed figures seem like priests in costume rather than practitioners with skills. The problem is the instruments. There is a category of object that appears repeatedly in these carved scenes that scholars have labeled as the bandudu bucket and the mullalu cone. The bucket is a small container held in one hand. The cone is a pointed object held in the other. The accepted interpretation is that these are ritual purification tools, that the bucket holds holy water or sacred liquid, and that the cone is used to sprinkle or apply it. This interpretation is not based on any Sumerian text that describes the ritual use of these objects in this context. It is based on assumption. It is based on the need to fit these objects into the ritual framework rather than any other. The academic community landed on this interpretation in the 19th century when the material was being cataloged for the first time. And that initial classification has been carried forward with remarkably little challenge ever since. But look at what other objects appear in these same scenes. On a cylinder seal housed in the British Museum, catalogued as part of the Akkadian period collection, and dated to approximately 2300 BCE, a bird-headed figure stands over a supine human form. The bird-headed figure holds in its right hand an object that is tapered at one end and wider at the other, with what appear to be graduated markings along its length. In its left hand, it holds something that curves. These two objects, taken together, have no functional parallel in any ceremonial or religious context anyone has been able to identify. They have a very clear functional parallel in medical and surgical instrumentation. The tapered, graduated object matches the morphology of a probe or a dilator. The curved object matches the morphology of a retractor or a needle. These are not exotic comparisons. These are the most basic tools of surgical intervention, and they have looked essentially the same across human history because the human body has not changed and the problems of accessing it have not changed. A probe from ancient Sumer and a probe from a modern operating theater are different in material and manufacture, but identical in purpose and form. The fact that the same forms appear in the hands of 6,000-year-old carved figures is not a coincidence that academic archaeology has successfully explained. It is a coincidence that academic archaeology has successfully ignored. The Sumerian medical texts are the part of this story that received the least popular attention, and they are the part that changes everything about how you read the carved images. The Sumerians had a medical system, a real one. Not folk remedies scrawled on a single clay tablet, but a documented, categorized, multi-tablet body of medical literature that covered diagnosis, treatment, pharmacology, and procedural intervention. The diagnostic handbook, known in Assyriology as the Sakheku, is a series of around 40 clay tablets that describes a systematic diagnostic approach to disease. The physician, called the Azu in Sumerian and the Asu in Akkadian, is described as performing physical examination, observing symptoms, drawing conclusions about internal conditions from external signs. This is not the behavior of a priest performing ritual. This is the behavior of a clinician. More specifically, the Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe surgical procedures, the incision of wounds, the drainage of abscesses, the treatment of broken bones with splinting and binding methods that are structurally identical to what early modern medicine reinvented in the 18th century. They describe the use of specialized instruments for these procedures, and they do not describe these procedures as spiritual acts. They describe them as medical interventions with expected outcomes, with follow-up assessments, and with specific materials we can now chemically identify as having genuine antimicrobial or wound-healing properties. Cassia, myrrh, thyme, cedar resin. All of these appear in Sumerian medical prescriptions, All of them have been verified by modern pharmacological research as having real biological activity against infection or inflammation. The Sumerians were not guessing. They were applying knowledge. The question is where that knowledge came from and how it got so precise so quickly. And this is where the bird-headed figures stop being a side note and become the central question. Because in the same textual tradition that describes the Azu physician, there is a parallel tradition that describes the Asipos, a different kind of practitioner associated specifically with the Apkallu lineage. The Asipos were not purely spiritual figures. They were described as possessing knowledge that came through the Apkallu tradition, knowledge specifically said to be older than the flood, older than human civilization, as the Sumerians knew it. And the procedures attributed to the Asipos tradition are not limited to prayer and incantation. They include direct physical interventions that the texts describe in procedural language. The distinction between the Azu and the Asipos in the Sumerian record is significant and underappreciated. It suggests not one medical tradition, but two running in parallel, one developed by human practitioners and one inherited from the Apkallu source. And the one attributed to the Apkallu is consistently described as the older and more complete of the two. When you hold that textual tradition next to the carved images of bird-headed figures performing physical interventions on human bodies, the ritual explanation becomes something you have to actively choose in order to avoid the other explanation. You have to decide to look at all of this and say, no, it is symbolic, because the alternative requires you to ask a question that has no comfortable answer within the current model of human historical development. Where did a 6,000-year-old civilization get surgical knowledge precise enough to document specific instruments, specific materials with verifiable pharmacological properties, and a procedural approach to physical medicine that would not be matched in the Western world until the Renaissance? The ancient astronaut interpretation makes a very specific claim here. It claims that the Apkallu were not mythological figures. It claims that the Sumerian accounts of beings who arrived from elsewhere, who taught humanity the foundations of civilization, who were not biologically human in the way the Sumerians understood themselves to be human, should be read as historical records rather than mythology. And it claims that the bird-headed appearance of the Apkallu in the visual record is not a costume or a metaphor. It is a description. This claim is not provable with the evidence currently available. That is important to say directly, but it is also not disprovable. And the consistency with which it is dismissed rather than engaged with is itself a data point worth examining. Because the alternative explanation requires you to accept several things simultaneously. You must accept that a civilization with no documented precursor culture spontaneously developed advanced urban planning, a writing system, a legal code, a multi-category medical literature, and a visual art tradition depicting surgical procedures. You must accept that the instruments carved in unmistakable procedural detail are ritual objects with no functional purpose, even though no text ever describes their ritual use. You must accept that the Sumerian accounts of the Apkallu as teachers who came from a non-human origin are purely allegorical, even though the Sumerians wrote history and mythology in the same script, and often in the same documents and clearly distinguish between them. And you must accept that the convergence of all of this is a set of coincidences that requires no further examination. That is a lot to accept. And the more you look at the details, the less comfortable that acceptance becomes. The specific anatomy of the bird head matters, and it has been almost entirely overlooked in both popular and academic discussions. The Apkallu in bird-headed form are not depicted with generic bird features. The beak structure, the cranial proportion, and the eye placement vary in ways that suggest the carvers were attempting to represent something specific rather than simply invoking bird symbolism. Some depictions show a long, straight beak associated with wading birds. Others show a curved beak. The cranial proportions in some cylinder seal impressions are notably large relative to the body, a feature that appears consistently enough across multiple artists and multiple sites that it does not read as artistic variation. it reads as a feature the artists were instructed to include because it was part of what they were representing. The Ubaid culture occupied southern Mesopotamia from approximately 6500 BCE to 3800 BCE. This is before Sumer as a distinct civilization. This is before writing. And the Ubaid left behind fired clay figurines with elongated heads, large eyes set in a distinctly non-human way, and features that appear more reptilian than mammalian. Some of these figurines depict a female figure nursing an infant. The infant has the same non-human features as the adult. Whatever was being depicted as a natural being with offspring, not as a supernatural entity. This detail matters. A supernatural figure in ancient iconography is almost never depicted performing mundane biological functions like nursing young. The Ubaid figurines look like portraits. The transition from Ubaid figurines to the Sumerian Apkallu imagery is not a clean break. There is continuity. The non-human teacher figure runs through Mesopotamian cultural memory from the Ubaid period through Akkadian and Babylonian civilization. It is one of the most persistent motifs in the entire archaeological record of the region, and it is consistently associated, across all of its appearances, with the transmission of advanced knowledge to humanity. That is not the pattern of mythology. In mythology, non-human figures teach humanity through divine intervention, through prophetic vision, through cosmic revelation. In Mesopotamian records, the Apkallu teach through demonstration, through showing, through sitting with human practitioners and transferring specific technical skills. That is the pattern of instruction. That is the pattern of a knowledge transfer from one group of beings to another. The medical dimension of this transfer is documented precisely enough that it is possible to trace specific Sumerian medical concepts into later traditions. Babylonian medicine carried forward Sumerian pharmacological knowledge almost intact. From Babylon, it entered Persian medical practice. Elements of it appear in the earliest Greek medical texts. The Hippocratic tradition, presented as the origin point of Western medicine, is not actually an origin point. It is a point of documentation in a continuous transmission that goes back, if you trace it carefully, to a Sumerian source. And the Sumerian source, by the Sumerians' own account, was not indigenous. It was taught to them. None of this is hidden. All of it is sitting in published academic literature. The clay tablets are translated. The cylinder seals are photographed and cataloged. The diagnostic handbook has been studied by Assyriologists for over a century. The Apkallu tradition is discussed in every serious work on Sumerian religion. What is missing is not the evidence. What is missing is the willingness to let the evidence lead somewhere that disrupts the foundational assumption of the field, which is that human civilization developed entirely from within human capacity, that no external input was involved, and that any ancient account describing non-human teachers should be read as primitive religion rather than recorded history. That assumption is not a conclusion reached by following evidence. It is a premise. It determines what counts as evidence and what gets reclassified as ritual, as symbol, as mythology. And when the premise is doing that much work, it is worth asking what the evidence would look like if the premise were removed. If you removed that premise and looked at the bird-headed figures with fresh eyes, what would you see? You would see beings that a sophisticated urban civilization depicted with consistent physical features across hundreds of years and multiple artistic traditions. You would see those beings depicted in direct physical proximity to human bodies in a way that no other class of figure in the Sumerian visual record is depicted. You would see them holding objects whose forms are functionally identical to surgical instruments. You would see this visual tradition running parallel to a written medical tradition that describes procedural interventions of precisely the kind suggested by the visual record. You would see that tradition attributed, in the texts themselves, to the knowledge the Apkallu brought before the flood. And you would see all of it emerging from a civilization that appeared too quickly and with too much precision to be explained by the usual models of gradual accumulation. The specific procedure question is where the argument becomes most concrete. There are cylinder seal impressions in which the bird-headed figure appears to be performing a procedure on the head or neck region of the supine human figure. The position of the instrument-holding hands, the angle of approach, and the location of contact with the human figure are all specifically indicated by the carving. Head and neck surgical procedures are among the most technically demanding in modern medicine. They require precise knowledge of anatomy. They require instruments specifically designed for the architecture of that region. And they require a conceptual model of the body's internal structures that cannot be developed without either systematic dissection or some form of access that allows you to understand what is below the surface. The Sumerians had anatomical knowledge. Their medical texts describe internal organs with enough specificity to indicate first-hand observation. The liver was considered the seat of life force in Sumerian cosmology, and clay models of sheep livers have been found at Mesopotamian sites used for divination, a practice that required detailed knowledge of organ morphology. You cannot make anatomically accurate clay models of an internal organ without having examined that organ directly. The question of how that examination extended to understanding surgical access to the head and neck is one that has not been adequately addressed. The wider pattern of this selective dismissal is worth noting because the Sumerian bird-headed surgeons are not isolated. They are part of a global pattern of ancient imagery depicting non-human beings in instructional proximity to human practitioners. The Dogon's Nomo, the amphibious beings said to have brought astronomical and agricultural knowledge from the Sirius system. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, depicted consistently as a feathered serpent, who brought calendar science and medical knowledge to the ancient inhabitants of the region. The Oans of the Babylonian tradition, described explicitly by the Babylonian priest Berossus as a fish-formed being, who came from the sea and taught humanity everything it needed to know about civilization before returning to the water at night. Berossus wrote this in the 3rd century BCE, drawing on archival sources that have since been lost. He was working as a historian and priest. And he described Oans with a specificity that is startling. He noted the being's dual nature in physiological detail. He described its behavior patterns. He noted that it did not eat human food. These are the observations of someone recording what was in the sources, not constructing a creation myth. If you take Berossus at face value, the way we take any other ancient historian at face value, when their account is not cosmologically inconvenient, then the beings who taught Mesopotamian civilization were real beings with a physical existence, a biology different from human biology, and a relationship with humanity that was deliberate and instructional rather than mythological. The bird-headed surgeons carved on Sumerian walls fit exactly into that framework. They are the place where the physical record is specific enough that you can look at it and say, this is a depiction of a procedure. These are instruments with identifiable functions. This being is not human, and this civilization, which produced this image, also left us medical texts demonstrating that they had knowledge of the procedures suggested by the image. Why would a civilization record this at all? Administrative records make obvious sense. Property records, tax records, trading agreements, all of these have clear functional reasons to exist, but a carved scene of a non-human being performing a surgical procedure on a human body, repeated across multiple sites and multiple centuries, is not an administrative record. It is a record of something the civilization believed was foundational enough to preserve in permanent stone. That is not the behavior of a culture inventing mythology. That is the behavior of a culture maintaining a historical record of something it witnessed. The distinction between witnessing and imagining is one the Sumerians encoded in their language. That window has been open for over 100 years. The field of archaeology has been walking past it for over 100 years. The scholars who might want to pursue these questions are the ones with the most to lose professionally by doing so. The result is a body of evidence that sits in perfect visibility, available to anyone who looks, and is simultaneously invisible to the people whose job it is to look. What remains is the carved image, the bird-headed figure, the supine human body, the instruments held with unmistakable purpose. 6,000 years of silence from the being that held them, and a civilization that took the time to put this scene on a wall, in permanent stone, as a record of something they clearly thought mattered enough to preserve. The Sumerians were not careless with what they chose to record. Everything in their visual archive meant something specific.